The airport officer looked at my passport, the way people look at something they're not sure is real. He turned it over once, checked the photo, looked at me, checked the photo again. Behind him, the departure board scrolled through gate changes and delays. Gate C-17, my gate, was still showing green. I had maybe 40 minutes before boarding. I had a window seat reserved. I had a conference call scheduled the morning I landed. I had a life that was supposed to continue in a straight line for the next 72 hours. And the only reason I was standing in this particular corridor at this particular moment was because a secondary screening officer had waved me sideways before I reached the gate. I thought it was random. Those things happen. I stepped aside without complaint. That was before 2 officers joined the first one. That was before I saw the folder. "Mr. Carter!" The older officer, gray at the temples, no visible emotion, held the folder like it was nothing special, like he did this every afternoon, like I was just another name on another list. "Are you aware of any financial crimes connected to your name?" I almost laughed, not from amusement, from the pure absurdity of the question. "Financial crimes?" I said it back to him like I needed to confirm the words were real. "Yes, sir." "No," I shook my head. "I'm not aware of any. I don't have any criminal record. You can check, there's nothing there." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that doesn't mean agreement, the kind that means he's heard that before. "We'd like you to come with us." The room they put me in smelled like industrial cleaning product and recycled air. 1 table, 3 chairs, a water bottle they placed in front of me and never replaced when it emptied. I sat there for 47 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall count every one of them, trying to stay calm, trying to remember if I had paid every tax return on time, trying to locate any possible version of my life that could explain why I was sitting in this room instead of boarding a plane. When the investigator finally walked in, she was younger than I expected. Late 30s, maybe 40. She carried a manila folder that was thicker than it had any right to be. She set it down carefully, like it had weight beyond the paper inside it. "Mr. Carter, I'm Special Agent Diane Marsh, Financial Crimes Division." She sat across from me without extending a hand. "Do you know why you're here?" "No," I said, "I genuinely don't." She opened the folder, turned it around to face me. I leaned forward and stopped breathing. There were documents, loan agreements, mortgage applications, business credit lines, pages and pages of them, each one clean and official and stamped with the kind of authority that made them feel inescapable. Some of them had letterheads I recognized from banks I'd never done business with. Some had property addresses in states I'd never lived in. All of them had my name on them. My full legal name, Daniel Robert Carter. Date of birth, social security number, the address of my apartment in Manhattan, details so specific, so accurate, that for one dizzying second I almost wondered if I had done this. If I had somehow sleepwalked through the last decade and a half of my life, signing documents I couldn't remember, creating debt I couldn't account for. Then I reached the signature line. "I didn't sign these," I said. Agent Marsh watched me. "These signatures look like mine, but I've never seen any of these documents." This loan from 2011, I was living in a studio in Chicago, I was 25 years old, I was making $48,000 a year I didn't have. I stopped, pressed my hand flat against the table, tried to organize the thoughts that were collapsing over each other. "How much is the total debt?" She held my gaze. "As of this month, $3.2 million. The number sat in the air between us like something physical. $3.2 million. $3.2 million attached to my name, my identity, my social security number, my entire financial existence. And I had not signed a single document in that folder. "Someone stole my identity," I said. Agent Marsh nodded once. "That's what we're trying to determine." "Then check." I heard something in my own voice that I didn't recognize. Not anger yet, something before anger, the place you go right before anger arrives. "Run whatever you need to run, pull my actual financial records, talk to my employer. I've worked at the same firm for 11 years, I have never been flagged for anything, I have a clean credit history, or I had one until apparently." I stopped again. "How long has this been happening?" She looked down at the folder, back at me. "The earliest document we've identified is dated 15 years ago." I sat with that number. 15 years. 15 years ago I was 24. Fresh out of a state university. living in a shared apartment with 2 roommates, working an entry-level analyst position, eating sandwiches I made myself because restaurants felt like a luxury. 15 years ago, I was no one. Nobody with access to my information would have thought my name was worth anything. Unless they knew me. Unless they knew I was going to build something worth borrowing against. I need you to understand something before I go further. I didn't grow up rich. I didn't grow up stable. I grew up in a house in rural Ohio where the word budget was used the same way other families used the word crisis. Constantly, desperately, always in reference to something that had already gone wrong. My father, Richard Carter, worked manufacturing jobs that kept disappearing. My mother, Susan Carter, worked part-time at a grocery store and spent the rest of her time managing the financial wreckage my father periodically created. The bad investments. The second mortgage they took when I was 12. The truck he financed that he couldn't afford 3 months later. They were not bad people. I want to be careful about that. They were not cruel. They were not cold. My mother used to sit with me on the back porch in summer evenings and quiz me on my homework even when she was exhausted. My father taught me to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning, patient in a way he never seemed to be about anything else. There were real moments of warmth in that house. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But the financial stress was relentless, and children absorb things even when adults think they're hiding them. By the time I was 14, I understood exactly how little money we had. By 16, I had decided I was not going to live that way as an adult. Not from shame, not from disgust, from something closer to self-preservation. I studied, I worked. I got a partial scholarship and supplemented it with loans I paid off myself over 8 years. I moved to Chicago for my first job, moved to New York for my second, built a career in corporate finance at a firm that valued competence and rewarded discipline. I wasn't wealthy by any extraordinary standard, but by 35 I owned my apartment. I had no credit card debt, and I had a savings account that finally let me sleep through the night without calculating whether I could afford to. I called my parents every 2 weeks. I sent money home when they needed it, not every time they asked because they asked often, but when it seemed genuine. When my father's truck needed repairs. When my mother's dental work cost more than their insurance covered. I told myself that was what you did. That was maintaining a relationship without being consumed by one. I thought I had figured it out. The balance, the distance, the way to love your family without drowning in their chaos. I thought 15 years of carefully maintained boundaries meant I was safe. Agent Marsh let me sit in silence for a while after I told her I didn't know where the accounts came from. I think she was watching to see what I'd do with the quiet, whether I'd fill it with excuses or panic, or the specific kind of over-explaining that guilty people do when they're trying to sound innocent. I didn't do any of that. I just sat there looking at those documents, trying to understand how someone had built an entire financial shadow identity using my name across 15 years without me once receiving a collections call, a credit alert, a single piece of mail that looked wrong. Then I realized, where were the bills being sent? Marsh tilted her head slightly. The statements, I said, the loan statements, where were they being mailed? She checked the file, slid one document across to me and pointed to the mailing address section. The address on the paper was not my apartment in Manhattan. It was a house in Dayton, Ohio. A house I had grown up in. Something cold moved through me. Something that wasn't quite a thought yet. I looked at that Dayton address and felt my mind start making connections I wasn't ready for. Edges of a shape I couldn't fully see yet. Mr. Carter, Marsh's voice was careful, measured. I want to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. The person who created these accounts, based on what we found so far, they had access to your personal documents. Your original social security card, your birth certificate, tax records going back decades. She paused. The person who did this knew you very personally. I didn't answer her, because the cold thing inside me had already started to solidify into something I wasn't ready to name. I flew home to Ohio 2 days later, not because anyone told me to, not because it was required, because the Dayton address was sitting inside my chest like a splinter, and the only way to deal with a splinter is to go in after it. I hadn't been home in 14 months. The house looked the same from the outside, the same aluminum siding, the same concrete porch steps, the same oak tree in the front yard that my father had always meant to trim but never did. My mother's wind chimes were still there by the front door. They were the same ones she'd hung up when I was maybe 10 years old. I sat in my rental car for a long time before I went inside. I was trying to hold onto the version of this story where I was wrong, where the Dayton address was a coincidence, where some external criminal had simply known the right information and exploited it, where the people behind that door were as innocent as I wanted them to be. I was trying, very deliberately, not to think about the fact that my parents were the only people in the world who had ever had access to my original Social Security card. My mother had kept it in a fireproof box in her bedroom closet. I knew because she'd shown it to me when I was 17 and needed it for a job application. I knocked on the door. My father answered. He looked older than I expected. They always do when you don't see them regularly. He'd lost weight. His hands, when he reached out to pull me into a hug, felt lighter than I remembered, like the years had quietly taken something from them. "Daniel," he said my name like relief, like exhaling. I hugged him back, and over his shoulder, I looked at my mother coming out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, already smiling, already opening her mouth to say something warm and ordinary. And I thought about $3.2 million, and my name on 15 years of documents I had never seen. And the investigator's voice. The person who did this knew you very personally. I held the hug a moment longer than I needed to, because some part of me already knew, and some part of me was not ready for what came next. My mother made pot roast. That's the detail I keep coming back to even now. She made pot roast and set the table with the good placemats, the blue ones she only brought out when company came or when she wanted a meal to feel like more than it was. There was bread. There was a pitcher of sweet tea. She had lit a candle in the center of the table, the short vanilla one she kept in the cabinet above the stove. She was trying very hard to make this feel normal. I sat across from my father and watched him cut his meat and thought about a folder full of documents with my name on them. And I said nothing. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about nothing of consequence. My mother asked about my flight. My father asked about work in the vague way he always did, not because he didn't care, but because he'd never entirely understood what I did for a living. I answered in the same vague way I always answered. The candle flickered once. Outside, a car passed slowly through the neighborhood. It was the most ordinary dinner I had ever found unbearable. "You seem tired," my mother said. "Long week. You work too hard." She said it with affection, the same way she'd said it since I was 23. Like overworking was my one flaw, the harmless thing she was allowed to gently criticize. "You need to take better care of yourself, Daniel." I looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I had a meeting with a federal investigator 2 days ago," I said. My father's fork stopped moving, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies where the cutlery clatters and the chair scrapes back. His fork simply paused, halfway between his plate and his mouth, for just a beat too long before he set it down carefully at the edge of the plate. My mother's expression didn't change. That was the thing. Her expression didn't change in the way it would if this was news. "What kind of investigator?" she asked. "Financial crimes." I kept my voice even. I'd spent 2 days deciding to keep my voice even. "They stopped me at the airport. They had a folder with my name on millions of dollars in debt that I've never seen, loans I've never applied for, mortgages on properties I've never set foot in." I paused. The statements were being sent to this address. Silence. Real silence, not the comfortable quiet of a family dinner, but something with mass and temperature to it. Something that pressed against the walls of the kitchen. My father looked at his plate. "Dad." He didn't look up. "Dad, look at me." He looked up. And the thing I saw in his face, it wasn't guilt exactly, not the sharp-edged kind. It was something more exhausted than that. Something that had been carried a very long time. "How much do you know?" he said. 3 words. Not "I don't know what you're talking about." Not "that sounds like identity theft, we should call the police." Not any of the responses an innocent person reaches for when they're accused of something they didn't do. "How much do you know?" My mother made a sound. Small. Involuntary. She pressed her fingers to her lips and looked at a spot on the table that wasn't her plate and wasn't me, some middle distance that didn't require her to be present for what was happening. "Tell me everything," I said. "They didn't tell me everything that night. They told me some of it. They told me the shape of it, the broad, devastating outline, and filled in details haltingly, inconsistently, with gaps that I would spend the next 3 weeks filling in myself. But they told me enough for me to understand that the life I'd believed I was living, the clean and separate life I'd built on discipline and distance, had been quietly used as collateral for 15 years. My father spoke mostly. My mother cried in the careful way she always cried, silently, composed, tears sliding down her face while she kept her hands folded in front of her like she was in a waiting room. It had started, my father said, when I was 24. I had just accepted my first real job offer, analyst position at a consulting firm in Chicago, a salary that felt enormous at the time even though it was perfectly ordinary by industry standards. I had called home to tell them. My mother had cried on the phone, happy tears, proud of me. My father had said, "That's my son," asterisk, in a voice that still, even now, even after everything, I can hear clearly. 2 weeks after that call, he had taken out a small personal loan, $14,000. He had used my name. He had used my social security number, which he'd had access to since I was 17. He'd had a copy of my birth certificate. My mother kept copies of everything in that fireproof box, meticulous about documents in the way that people who have experienced financial chaos sometimes are. He used my new employer's name as a reference. He used the Chicago address I'd given them, the studio apartment I'd just moved into. $14,000 to cover a debt that had been threatening to take the house. I was going to pay it back, my father said. He wasn't looking at me. I had a plan. There was overtime coming, and I thought. "Don't," I said. He stopped. "Don't tell me about the plan." My voice stayed level, but something underneath it wasn't. "Tell me what happened next." What happened next, I would come to understand over the following weeks, was not a single dramatic decision. It was a series of small ones. The overtime didn't come through. There was a medical bill, my mother's back surgery, the one she'd mentioned briefly on the phone as asterisk handled, "Don't worry about it." Then a second loan to cover the interest on the first. Then my father's car. Then the roof. Then a business venture he'd gone into with a man from his church that had dissolved within a year, leaving debt that had nowhere to go. Each time they'd used my name. Not because they were strategic criminals. Not because they sat down one evening and decided to destroy their son's financial identity. They did it the way people do most terrible things, incrementally, with the constant promise that it was the last time, that this one would be repaid, that once this particular crisis passed, the whole thing would quietly disappear and I would never need to know. I found the documents in the second bedroom. My mother kept them there, in a shoebox at the back of the closet, behind the winter coats. I don't know if she showed me where they were deliberately or if some part of her had simply gotten tired of protecting the secret. She mentioned the closet when I asked where the household files were kept, and when I pulled the winter coats aside and found the box, she didn't try to stop me. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and went through them. There were 23 separate accounts, personal loans, 2 home equity lines I'd supposedly taken against a property I'd never owned, a small business credit line opened in 2017 under a LLC with my name attached, 3 credit cards I'd never held, a financing agreement for equipment my father had apparently purchased for the business venture that failed, 23 accounts, $3.2 million, assembled piece by piece over 15 years, while I was in Chicago and then New York, building something I believed was mine. I had a specific feeling going through those documents. I want to describe it accurately. It wasn't anger, not yet, not cleanly. It was more like the sensation of looking at a photograph taken of you without your knowledge, slightly wrong, slightly violating. The uncanny recognition of your own details, your name, your handwriting almost perfectly reproduced, your social security number appearing and reappearing like a refrain attached to a life you never lived. Someone had been living as me. The person living as me had borrowed recklessly, defaulted quietly, and hidden the evidence in a shoebox behind winter coats in a spare bedroom in Ohio. And the worst part, the part I kept returning to, sitting on that bed with papers spread across the comforter, was how well they knew me. The signatures weren't perfect, but they were close. They'd practiced. The biographical details were flawless. They knew my educational history, my employment timeline, the exact sequence of cities I'd lived in. They knew which details to use to make the documents credible. Of course they did. They were my parents. My mother came to the doorway of the guest room around 9 o'clock. My father was somewhere else in the house. I could hear the TV on low in the living room, which struck me as almost incomprehensible. He was watching television, while I sat in the next room going through evidence of what they'd done. She stood in the doorway without coming in. "Daniel." I didn't answer right away. I was reading a loan document from 2019. A significant one, $240,000, supposed real estate investment secured against my income. My income I'd been earning in New York while they were apparently pledging it as collateral in Ohio. "I know you're angry," she said. I set the paper down. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years, with the kind of attention that sees past the familiar face to the person behind it. She looked smaller than she used to. Her hair had gone mostly gray. She was holding her own elbows, hugging herself lightly, the way she used to when she was nervous. "I'm not angry," I said, which wasn't entirely true. But the anger was underneath something else right then, something heavier and harder to name. "I'm trying to understand. We didn't want to burden you." The words came out so genuinely, so sincerely. "Mom," I heard something break at the edge of my voice that I hadn't intended. "You borrowed $3 million under my name. That is not, I don't know how to explain to you that is the opposite of not burdening me." She pressed her lips together. "We needed help," she said finally. "And you were doing so well. You were doing so well, Daniel, and every time we called you there was another crisis here, and we knew you would say no, or you'd be disappointed, or you'd—" She stopped, looked away. "We knew we couldn't ask you. So you took it." The words came out quieter than I expected. "You couldn't ask me, so you took it." She didn't answer, which was in its own way an answer. I drove around for an hour after that, just drove. Got in the rental car and went through streets I'd grown up on. Past the high school I'd left as fast as I could. Past the Walmart parking lot where I'd had my first job. Past the church my parents still attended every Sunday. Past all of it without seeing any of it. Running numbers in my head the way my finance training had taught me to make automatic interest rates, compounding periods. The approximate total paid in interest alone on $3 million of undisclosed debt. The credit impact alone would take years to untangle. If they prosecuted, and Agent Marsh had used the phrase "if the investigation determines criminal intent with careful precision," that told me prosecution was more than hypothetical. My parents were looking at federal charges. Identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, depending on how the counts were structured, they were looking at serious prison time. My parents were in their late 60s. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat with the engine running. I thought about my father's hands at dinner, how light they'd felt. I thought about my mother's shoebox, how carefully the documents were organized inside it, how she'd kept every single one of them, every piece of evidence of what they'd done, filed, and preserved. Not the behavior of someone who'd forgotten. The behavior of someone who'd been waiting for 15 years for the moment they'd have to answer for it. I thought about the first loan, $14,000. 2 weeks after I'd called home to say I'd gotten the job. They'd heard the pride in my voice. They'd heard my future opening up. And within 2 weeks, they decided that future was something they could borrow against. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Your father wants to talk to you tonight. Please come back." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I turned the car around. My father was sitting at the kitchen table when I came back. The dinner dishes were cleared. The candle had burned down. He had a glass of water in front of him that he wasn't drinking, and both hands flat on the table, palms down, like he was steadying himself. I sat across from him. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "I need to ask you something," I said. He nodded. "When did you plan to stop?" He looked at me. "I need to know if there was ever a point, a specific point, where you told yourself, this is the last one, after this we'll come clean, or if it was always just the next one, and then the next one." My father was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree. The wind chimes knocked softly against the doorframe. "I told myself that every time," he said. But there was always something else." I nodded once. I opened my phone, pulled up the photograph I'd taken of the earliest document in the shoebox. I turned the screen to face him. "This one," I said. "This is the first one, $14,000. Dated," I checked the date, 11 days after I called to tell you I'd gotten the job offer." My father looked at the screen. "I had just started my career," I said. I was 24 years old, I had never hurt you, I had never refused to help you, and 11 days after I told you my good news, I stopped. Set the phone down. Did you ever plan to tell me? My father's jaw worked. He looked at his hands. No, he said. One word. Just that. No. I sat with it. No hesitation. No qualification. No, we thought about it or we almost did once. Just the clean, unambiguous truth he'd apparently decided in this moment to finally offer me. No, they had never planned to tell me, which meant they had never planned to stop. SI spent the next 3 weeks living out of the guest room. I didn't plan it that way. I had a return flight booked, an office expecting me back, a life in New York that had been placed on hold with the kind of brief clinical explanation that felt inadequate for what was actually happening, family emergency, working remotely for a few weeks, I'll keep you updated. My manager had been understanding. My colleagues had been understanding. Nobody pushed. Nobody asked the specific question that would have required me to say out loud. My parents committed federal financial crimes using my identity for 15 years, and I'm currently living in their guest room trying to figure out what that means. I worked mornings, client calls, analysis reports, the ordinary machinery of a career that had been chugging along independent of all of this. Then afternoons I spent at the kitchen table with the shoebox and a legal pad, going through every document methodically, building a timeline that grew more detailed and more damaging with each passing day. My parents moved around me quietly during those weeks. My mother cooked. My father watched the news in the evenings. They gave me space with the careful deference of people who understood they had no standing to ask for anything else. We ate most dinners together in a silence that was not hostile, but was not comfortable either. 3 people in a kitchen, navigating around the thing none of us had fully named yet. I was not ready to name it yet. I needed to understand it first. The timeline I assembled covered 15 years and touched almost every significant event in my adult life. The first loan, the $14,000, 11 days after I'd called about the job, had gone to cover a second mortgage payment they'd been unable to make. My father had been between jobs. The bank had sent a final notice. They had, I think, genuinely panicked. The second loan came 8 months later, slightly larger. It covered the first loan's interest plus a medical expense, my mother's knee surgery, the one she'd mentioned to me as minor, outpatient, nothing to worry about. I had sent flowers. Then there was a gap of almost 2 years. I used to think that gap meant something. I used to think it represented a period where they had tried to pull back, maybe even started repaying, maybe felt enough guilt to stop. I stopped thinking that when I found the payment records. They hadn't stopped. They'd simply gotten more careful. They'd switched to a different bank after the second loan, one where the name Daniel Carter didn't yet have any history. They'd opened accounts slowly, deliberately spacing them out. The 2-year gap wasn't conscience, it was strategy. That realization, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me, was the first time I felt something I could honestly call rage. Not the hot, reactive kind, the cold kind, the kind that settles into your chest and stays there. I found the business loan on a Thursday, $212,000. Opened in 2016 under a small LLC, RC Ventures asterisk. The initials obviously my father's, with my name listed as a co-signatory and my income from that year cited as the primary source of repayment capacity. The loan had been used to purchase equipment for a landscaping business. My father had started with a man named Gerald Hopper, whom I had never met, and who had apparently taken his half of the business proceeds and relocated to Florida sometime in 2018, while my father was left holding debt. He couldn't pay in a company that existed mostly on paper. I had been a co-signatory for a business I'd never heard of, with a man I'd never met. I sat in the kitchen holding that document for a long time. My mother came in around 4 o'clock to start dinner. She saw my face and stopped. "The business loan," I said. She set down the grocery bag she was carrying. "Sit down, Mom." She sat. "Tell me about Gerald Hopper." She told me. It took a while and it required prompting, and there were moments where I had to consciously slow my breathing and remind myself that anger without information was useless. But she told me. Gerald Hopper had been a friend of my father's from church. The business had seemed like a genuine opportunity, My father had believed in it. My mother had believed in my father. But you used my name, I said, for a business investment that I knew nothing about. Your father thought it would work, she said. He was so sure it would work. That's not what I asked. She was quiet. I asked why you used my name. Because we couldn't get the loan otherwise. The words came out simply, without particular defensiveness. Just fact. Your credit was better, your income was better, the bank wouldn't have approved your father a loan. I nodded slowly. So you needed my name? Yes. You needed my name and you took it without asking me. For a business I had no knowledge of, with a man I'd never met that eventually failed and left you with $200,000 of debt under my identity. Daniel, I'm not yelling at you. I wasn't. My voice was very quiet. I'm just making sure I understand it correctly. I want to make sure I understand it exactly as it happened. She pressed her fingers to the table. Looked down at them. We thought it would work, she said again. And I realized that was genuinely the whole explanation. Not malice. Not calculated exploitation. Just the terrible, ordinary human capacity to convince yourself that the risk you're taking with someone else's life is going to work out fine, so there's no need to tell them about it. I asked my father to sit with us that evening. The three of us at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes pushed aside. No good placemats this time. No candle. Just the overhead light and three people who needed to have a conversation that was 15 years overdue. I had my legal pad in front of me. I'd written the timeline on it, each account, each date, each amount. 47 lines covering both sides of 3 pages. I turned it to face them. My father looked at it for a long moment. I know it looks, he started. I need you to stop explaining what it looks like, I said. I need you to explain what it was. He stopped. Walk me through it from the beginning. Not just the facts, I have the facts. I want to know what you were thinking, what you told yourselves each time. My father looked older than he had at the airport, which was strange because I hadn't been at the airport, he hadn't been there. But something in my memory was superimposing the image of that gray-templed officer holding the folder with what I was seeing now. My father, across a kitchen table, looking at 47 lines that represented 15 years of choices he couldn't take back. The first one, he said slowly, I told myself it was a bridge loan. A bridge loan. Until I found work, until things stabilized. I was going to pay it back within a year and you'd never have to know. And the second one, he paused. The second one, that was harder to justify. I told myself it was still the same situation. That if I'd been able to repay the first one, I'd have done both at once. That it was all still the same problem. And at some point, I said, it stopped being a single problem you were solving and started being just the way things were. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. My mother had her hands in her lap below the table. I could tell from her posture she was gripping them together. Can I ask you something? I said to her. She looked at me. Did you ever think about what would happen to me, specifically? I leaned forward slightly. Not to the family, not to the money situation, to me, to my credit, my reputation, my name. Did either of you ever sit down and think through what would happen to Daniel, not what would happen to the problem you were solving, but what would happen to me if this was ever discovered? The silence that followed was long enough to answer the question before either of them spoke. We thought, my mother began. Don't tell me what you thought about the loans. Tell me if you thought about me. Her eyes filled. We thought you'd be okay, she said. You were always okay. You were always the one who figured things out. Something moved through my chest, not anger. Something that came before anger and stayed longer. I was okay, I said carefully, because I worked very hard for a very long time to make myself okay. That wasn't luck. That wasn't just something that happened to me. I stopped. I built that. I built all of it. And you used it. Not because you're evil people, I'm not saying that, but you used it and you never asked and you never told me because you decided that what you needed mattered more than what I'd built. My mother was crying now, quietly the way she always cried. My father was looking at his hands. We thought if you ever found out, my mother said, voice barely above a whisper, you would understand, because you love us, because you've always helped us when we needed it. I sat with that for a moment. You thought I'd understand. Yes. But you never gave me the chance to understand. You never told me. You decided in advance that I'd be fine with it and then you never asked. She didn't answer. If you'd called me in 2009 and said, Daniel, we're in trouble, we're about to lose the house, we need $14,000, what do you think I would have said? My mother looked at me. You would have said no, she said quietly. Maybe, I leaned back. Maybe I would have. Maybe I would have said I can help with some of it, not all of it. Maybe I would have said let me look at the numbers and figure out what's actually possible. I don't know what I would have said, but it would have been my choice. It would have been my decision about my own name. I looked at the legal pad between us. You took that from me, I said. For 15 years, every single time. The wind chimes moved outside. My father made a sound. Brief, involuntary. He pressed his mouth closed, looked away at the window, at the dark glass, at nothing. We're sorry, his voice came out broken at the edges. Daniel, I know that's not, I know that doesn't. I know you're sorry, I said. I did know, that was the complicated part. I could hear it in his voice and I believed it completely, and it didn't change a single number on that legal pad. What happens now? My mother asked. I looked at her. There's a federal investigation, I said. I didn't start it, I didn't report you, but it exists and they know what they know and I can't make that go away. I paused. You need a lawyer, both of you. Before I leave here, you need to have called a lawyer. My father nodded, barely. And after that, my mother said. I stood up, picked up the legal pad, looked at both of them, these two people who had raised me, who had been genuinely proud of me, who had also spent 15 years treating my name like a resource they were entitled to draw from whenever they ran low. I don't know yet, I said. And I meant it. I went to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear my mother crying. Not quietly this time. The real kind, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to hold back. I didn't go to her. I sat in the dark and thought about a 24-year-old kid in a Chicago studio apartment who had called home to share good news. And I thought about what that phone call had cost him, without his knowledge, without his consent, for 15 years. I went back to New York on a Sunday. I didn't tell my parents I was leaving until the morning of. I came downstairs with my bag already packed, and my mother looked at it and then looked at me, and something in her face arranged itself into an acceptance she hadn't quite managed during the weeks I'd been there. Will you call? She asked. Yes, I said. It wasn't a promise of frequency or warmth. It was just yes, I would call. What the calls would look like going forward was a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. My father walked me to the rental car. We stood beside it in the driveway for a moment, the oak tree above us moving in a light wind. He looked like he wanted to say something that would fix it. I could see him searching for the words, the specific combination that would land correctly, that would leave things between us at something better than where they were. There weren't words for that. If there were, I didn't know them either. Get a good lawyer, I said, not someone cheap, someone who actually knows federal financial crimes. He nodded. I'm not going to tell them to go easy on you, I said. I can't do that, but I'm also not going to call them and ask them to push harder than they're already pushing. What happens will happen because of what you did, not because of anything I do. My father absorbed that. That's fair, he said quietly. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in 3 weeks, maybe longer. I got in the car, drove to the airport, sat at the gate for an hour watching planes come and go through the terminal windows, thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously. The way you do when your mind has been running at full capacity for so long it starts producing static instead of thoughts. The flight home was uneventful. I watched the clouds for a while, then I didn't watch anything. The legal process took 14 months. I won't detail all of it. Not because it wasn't significant, it consumed an enormous amount of time, money, and emotional energy, but because the procedural facts are not really the point of what I'm telling you. The point is not the paperwork. The point is what the paperwork represented. My attorney was a woman named Patricia Cole, mid-50s, who specialized in identity fraud cases and who had, she told me in our first meeting, seen versions of this story before. Not identically, but the shape of it, family member, prolonged unauthorized use, discovered late, was not as unusual as I'd believed. That was its own kind of devastating. I had spent weeks feeling like what had happened to me was singular, Some aberration so specific to my family's particular dysfunction that it couldn't be categorized. Learning that it had a category, that Patricia Cole had a file drawer for it, made it feel both more and less manageable simultaneously. She walked me through the process. The accounts would be disputed individually. The banks would need to be notified of the identity fraud. There would be hearings. There would be documentation requirements. My credit file, which had been, until Agent Marsh showed me that folder at the airport, completely clean, had by this point registered the investigations, and was a document I genuinely could not look at for several weeks without a specific physical discomfort in my chest. $3.2 million, 23 accounts, 15 years. It would take 14 months to unwind what had taken 15 years to construct, and at the end of those 14 months, I would emerge with my credit largely restored, my name detached from the fraudulent accounts, and a legal bill that I paid in full because paying it myself was the only part of the process I had complete control over. My parents, through their own attorney, cooperated fully with the federal investigation. This was, Patricia told me, the best possible choice they could have made under the circumstances. Full cooperation, full disclosure. My father made a formal statement admitting to every account. My mother corroborated it. They were not young. They had no prior record. The mitigating circumstances were real if not exculpatory. They received federal probation, mandatory financial counseling, restitution obligations that, given their actual financial situation, would realistically take years to fulfill. No prison time. I found out through my attorney. I had not attended the hearing. I sat in my apartment the evening I got the news and tried to locate what I felt about it. I expected relief, or anger that it wasn't more. What I found instead was something closer to exhaustion, the specific, bone-deep tiredness of a conclusion that doesn't feel like a conclusion, because the thing that ended in a courtroom had started in a relationship that existed before I had any memories at all. I called my mother 3 weeks after the sentencing. I'd been thinking about what to say for most of those 3 weeks. Not scripting it, that wasn't how I approached things. But thinking about what was actually true and what I actually needed her to understand and how to say it in a way that was honest without being cruel. She answered on the second ring. "Daniel?" The relief in her voice was immediate, unguarded. Whatever composure she'd maintained through the legal proceedings had apparently been expensive to sustain, because she sounded, in that single word, like someone who had been holding their breath for a month. "Hi, Mom." A pause. "How are you?" she asked. "Better," I said, which was true. The accounts are being resolved. My credit is recovering, work is fine." I paused. "I'm okay." "I'm glad," her voice was small. "Daniel, I want you to know, your father and I, every day we think about." "Mom," I stopped her gently. "I'm not calling to have that conversation. I know you're sorry. I believe that you're sorry. What I'm calling to say is something different." She went quiet. "I love you," I said. "I want to be clear about that before anything else. I'm not telling you this story ends with me disappearing from your lives. It doesn't." I could hear her breath catch slightly. "But I need you to understand something. And I need you to actually hear it, not just say you understand and then go back to the way things were." I stopped, chose the next words carefully. "You spent 15 years deciding what I could handle, what I needed to know, what I could be asked for, and what needed to just be taken without asking. You made those decisions for me, about me, because it was easier than having an honest conversation." The line was very quiet. "That's over," I said. "If you need something from me, money, help, anything, you ask me, directly. You tell me what's actually happening, and I will decide what I'm able to give. Sometimes the answer will be yes. Sometimes it won't be. But it will be my answer to a real question made with real information." "Okay," my mother said, barely above a whisper. "I'm not a resource," I said. "I'm your son, those are different things." She was crying. I could tell from the quality of the silence on her end. I didn't try to fix it, I let her cry. After a moment she said, I know that, Daniel. I'm so sorry we forgot." We talked for another 20 minutes. About small things mostly. Her garden, my apartment, whether my father's knee was improving, the ordinary texture of a family relationship, damaged and reconstructed and never quite the same shape as before, but present. Still present. I wasn't sure yet what that meant. Whether it was wisdom or stubbornness or just the particular way I'd been built. The kid from Ohio who'd learned early that you couldn't always choose your circumstances, only your response to them. Here's what I know now, looking back. My parents were not monsters. They were people who were drowning and grabbed the nearest thing that floated, which happened to be my name. They grabbed it the first time in genuine desperation. They kept grabbing it because the alternative, telling the truth, asking permission, accepting my refusal if I refused, was more terrifying to them than the lie. I understand that. I do not excuse it. Those two things can exist at the same time. Understanding someone's pain does not obligate you to absorb its consequences. Loving someone does not mean accepting every version of what that love costs you. I spent most of my 20s and 30s quietly managing the emotional distance between myself and my family, telling myself I had found the balance, that I knew exactly how close was close enough. I had it wrong. I thought distance was protection. What I didn't understand was that distance without honesty is just a different kind of vulnerability. My parents didn't need my proximity to use my name. They needed my trust. And I had given them that, quietly, without condition, simply by being the person I was. I don't regret being that person. I just understand now that trust is not the same as permission. And love is not the same as unlimited access to everything you've built. My credit score recovered fully 18 months after the airport. I received the notification on a Tuesday morning, an automated email from a monitoring service I'd set up during the investigation. I read it twice, set my phone down, made coffee, went to work, because that was always what I did. I went to work. I built things carefully. I showed up and I did not cut corners, and I paid what I owed, and I expected, perhaps naively, that the life I constructed from those habits would remain mine. It is mine now, fully legally, undeniably mine. It took 15 years to take it from me and 14 months to take it back. I call my parents every 2 weeks. My mother still asks if I'm eating enough. My father still watches the news too loud. The wind chimes are still on the front porch. The oak tree still needs trimming. Some things don't change. Some things do. I know the difference now, and knowing the difference I've found is enough.